What is up, YouTube? I'm Mr. Terry. I'm a high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher Acts video. All right, this week's poll has concluded, and this is what you guys chose. It's called How Gold Rush Miners Ate in the Wild West. And this is from the channel Tasting History with Max Miller, which I just covered for the first time last week, so it looks like you guys want some more. All right, the original video is linked down below. Please subscribe to Max's channel. And if you would like to vote, all you gotta do is go to the community page. Be sure to sub to the channel, go to the community page here on YouTube, and you will see the poll. Thank you to all of the channel members as well as the Patreon pledgers for your generous support. All right, let's get started. All right, mining is dangerous, but I am prepared. Got my mining helmet ready to go. Let's do this.
Today I'm filming from the old mining town of Cerro Gordo near Death Valley in California. Now back in the day, this was a rough place, your quintessential Old West town. A disagreeable burg full of stout, warm-hearted go-ahead men who were tearing fortunes out of the bowels of the earth. So naturally my question is, what did these bowel-tearing men like to eat? Well,
I just have to imagine right away that the food would suck. It's like, what do you have around you? You're mining in the wilderness, right? So what you hunt and stuff. I mean, he's showing some like biscuits and gravy. That'd be amazing. By the way, they showed that, or at least something close to it in that, what did they eat in World War II, right? I thought that looked good.
Their meal was biscuits and gravy, which I'm making using a recipe from 1881. So thank you to Trade Coffee for sponsoring this video as we eat like an Old West miner, this time on Tasting History.
So the one they had in the other video I'd watched, and I'll make sure to link it here at the end, was what did they eat during World War II, was like a form of biscuits and gravy. It looked like a much worse version because it didn't quite have the other elements you need. You need more like the sausage and stuff like that. But nevertheless, let's talk some Wild West history and Gold Rush.
Now back in the late 19th and early 20th century, this was a thriving community with a number of saloons, restaurants, dance halls, hotels, and other businesses, all catering to the needs of the miners who were extracting silver and lead in the surrounding mountains. Now, whether they were coming into...
Now, it's interesting because if you're talking about the end of the 1800s now, I feel like by this time, the who's who of the mining world have really staked their claim. Gold Rush breaks out 1848. People start flocking westward, right? And everybody's trying to stake their claim. And it was super violent. It's one of the most violent times in American history. And a lot of people went out there with big ideas of grandeur and with getting wealthy. And most people, by far, wound up with nothing, right? Absolutely nothing, became destitute. A handful of people here are going to strike it lucky by striking gold. And they've now laid their plots out where now you have these big mining companies. And these companies had to, draw people, basically build their own towns. And there's towns around the, around the West that were mining towns. Now, a lot of those you haven't heard of, like this one, because eventually the mine's going to dry up. But some that serve the areas are still around today. Say like a Sacramento, for example, California, is going to be from that, right? It's going to be a place where stuff gets sent to, and then you can send that to San Francisco, like a port like that. And this is a huge part of the colonization West.
Town to eat, or if they were staying out by the mountains,
manifest destiny,
making themselves a good meal. They relied basically on the 3 B's: beans, bacon, and biscuits. And last week I made the beans and bacon, so this week
all 3 of those aren't bad.
Now sometimes they would use sourdough to make biscuits, but very popular at the time was a combination of cream of tartar and saleratus. Saleratus being a salty form of baking soda. Now at that time there were not a lot of cookbooks coming out of the American West, but I actually think I found kind of the perfect one for this, because this mining town was said to have basically built Los Angeles. And so I'm going to be working from Los Angeles cookery from 1881.
Basically all those like Californian cities were all as a product of it, because California was only very lightly colonized at that time. I mean, the Spanish had come in and set up like missions for, converting people, but wasn't really used for economic settling. And once that gold hit, man, you know about manifest destiny. That was the whole U.S. saying, hey, everything from the Atlantic to the Pacific, everything there needs to be colonized by the U.S. It is a God-given right. It's literally what they believe. And it brought wars. You had the Mexican-American War, which is going to wrap up about the time, gold was discovered. How convenient was that there in the mid-1800s? And then eventually new states. And there you go. You get the next part of the U.S. story and adding that extra third of the country to the U.S.
Cream of tartar biscuits, Mrs. Milliken. 1 quart of flour, 3 heaping teaspoonfuls of pure cream of tartar, a piece of butter 2/3 the size of an egg, well worked in flour, 1 heaping teaspoonful of Babbitt's Celeritis dissolved in sweet milk.
Is that better
Make the
than
dough as soft as
what
can
you
be
normally
kneaded
cook with?
conveniently, roll a 1/2 inch thick, cut in biscuits, and bake in a quick oven. Now, there's nothing in this recipe that they wouldn't have possibly had access to, but milk would have definitely been a prized commodity, and if they were up in the hills, they probably wouldn't have had fresh milk.
You use water
But
or what?
they would have had access to evaporated milk.
Okay.
It was a fairly
Can
new
it?
invention from the 1850s by Gail Borden. You can use it basically just
Thanks,
like milk, but
Gail.
you can add a little bit of water if you want. 2 cups or 240 grams of flour, 1.5 heaping teaspoons of cream of tartar,
There it
a
is.
1/2 teaspoon of salt, 4 tablespoons of butter, a heaping 1/2 teaspoon of baking soda, about 3/4 of a cup or 175 milliliters of milk,
Exactly
either
much
regular
as
milk
a
or
heaping.
evaporated milk, and that is it. And you'll notice that I cut all the ingredients in half because I don't need to make that many biscuits right now. This will still make about
Whatever.
a dozen.
You gotta feed
so
the
first,
whole
whisk the cream of tartar and salt
mining
into the flour, and then add the
contingent.
butter in little pieces and work it into the flour with your fingers. You want to leave some nice big pieces in there though. Then stir the baking soda
wanna
into the
leave the
milk
pieces,
and
okay.
pour it into the flour mixture. I honestly don't know why she mixes it into the milk rather than just...
Okay, so I asked this in the previous video about like evaporated milk, and obviously it's good because, well, good for, because it can be stored. How is the taste different? Is it better? I can't imagine. If it was better, I feel like it'd be the standard thing, but any evaporated milk enjoyers, let me know down below.
putting it with the flour, which is what it would usually be done today, but I'm gonna follow what she says. Now work the dough until it just comes together. If you need a little more milk, you can go ahead and add it, but you just wanna add enough to make the dough stick. Once you have a nice dough, set it onto a lightly floured surface and knead it gently for just about a minute. You don't wanna overwork it, and then
left his
press
ring
it out
on.
or roll it out to about a 1/2 inch thick. Then cut it into biscuits. And the scraps you can kind of roll out again and cut into more biscuits. It's a very forgiving dough.
Don't wanna
Now you can
waste.
place these on a tray, but more commonly back then, they would have put into a well-buttered or lard-greased cast iron skillet. Then set that in the oven at 425 degrees Fahrenheit, 220 Celsius, and bake for about 15 minutes while we take a look at what else
not too
old
long.
miners in the Old West used to eat.
Gotta get the gravy. All right, time for history. Let's go.
On
It's my
January
part. This is my-
24th, 1848, James Marshall, working
My
at a
part.
sawmill owned by Johann Sutter on the American River in California,
Sutter's Mill.
found a small shiny stone in the mill race.
right. That
That
started
was
it.
the first gold nugget found that kicked off the California gold rush.
Remember that.
And within 3
well,
years,
I wasn't there, but yeah, Sutter's Mill from I forgot that there was like a single event, and that when that was found, that started the whole thing I was talking. I want to talk all about it again about, you know, the Western expansion and how the gold rush started and all that. But yeah, single event, and it's just like, you know, when you hit gold and stuff too, you didn't want to like tell everybody, because then everybody's going to be coming in claiming land. Like I said, people were coming here putting their lives on the line. They were putting their whole life savings and coming in and having the tools and whatever they needed to do this. And again, it turned violent. There was competition for this stuff. So I don't know if you really want to, you don't want to get the news out, you know, that you have this. You got to protect it as much as you can.
there's over 200,000 people made their way from all over the world.
That's
to
a lot.
find
You
their
gotta understand, that's a
fortune,
lot of
during
people
which
to go to
time
the
most of them
wilderness.
lost a fortune because the price of everything absolutely skyrocketed, and that included
Supply and
food.
demand,
A breakfast in San Francisco that cost 15 cents in 1848 would, by the end of 1850, cost $6. A single egg could cost $1, and a barrel of flour went from $3 to $400. That is about $16,000 in today's money for a barrel of flour. And so even though, at least at the beginning of the
gosh.
gold rush, people were picking up gold off the ground, most of them weren't keeping it. It was the people who were selling things to the prospect.
That sucks. Think of what that does to eat into your profit margins there. When you have this crazy hyperinflation here. Oh my gosh. I haven't seen hyperinflation this bad since the Weimar Republic.
As Pierre
all
Burton
know
said
how
of the
that
Klondike
ended.
gold rush, the people who made money weren't the ones who found a gold mine. They found a man who found a gold mine.
That
Now,
is
this rush of
exactly
money
what I
didn't
wanted to
last
say
very
there, yeah.
long, and so eventually prices came back
Such a
down.
good
But
business
basically,
opportunity.
Whenever and wherever silver or gold was found, this same kind of crazy inflation took place.
That's why you have cities, right? Cities exist in places that have economic value. That's it. And it could be on the Silk Road, and you find yourself at a place where two roads merge because there's a water source there. Maybe you have a place that has a natural harbor to it, deep waters that go up to the coast. You got a port city all of a sudden. This is how human society has developed and how it is ties to geography and how those two things are irreplaceable. Geography, society, history, it's all part of the same process.
So because of that, the foods that miners ate really ran the gamut from pretty not great to unbelievably fancy. Now, somewhere in the middle is perhaps the most famous miner food, and that is the Hangtown Fry, which supposedly was what you would order when you finally struck pay dirt. The story goes that a miner, having just found a load of gold, stumbled out of the Sierra foothills into Placerville. Though at the time the town was called Dry Diggins, though due to their penchant for hanging people whenever they did anything bad, it was more commonly known as...
It was like to be able to enforce this stuff. Now this is 1849. That's interesting. There we got some telegraph lines. A lot of these new technologies coming into play here, but it looks how just everything looks so new. They've chopped down all these trees.
Hangtown. There he walked into the elder people whenever they did anything bad. It was more commonly known as Hangtown. There he walked into the El Dorado Hotel, slapped a gold nugget on the bar, and ordered his favorite foods, all to be fried up in one dish. That was eggs cooked in bacon grease and then topped with fried oysters. And whether or not that story is actually true, the dish did become quite
they had
popular,
oysters there?
not just in that area where there were miners, but all throughout the U.S. at the time. Now, it was especially popular in San Francisco, where instead of canned oysters, which is what many people had to eat at the time, they were able to eat fresh oysters. Oysters were one of the most popular foods during this
period. This is starting to make sense now. How about how, if you don't know, San Francisco might be the most expensive city in the United States as far as price of living, and one of the highest in the world. And you could see had elite status immediately from the rich miners.
Period. I actually did a video last summer on the New York oyster craze, which is taking place around this same time. And it was so popular to eat oysters, no matter who you were, even if you were a miner out in the wilderness, that within 3 years of the gold rush starting, they had completely eaten away all of the oyster beds in and around San Francisco. So they had to start bringing oysters down from the Seattle area. Now, if eggs and oysters just ain't your thing, because that's not really something that I would eat, then there are even more exotic foods
lobster
on the
and
menu.
eggs or something
Specifically,
like that.
Galapagos tortoise. See, turtle soup, which was usually made with green turtle at the time, was very, very popular and was on menus everywhere. But it was rather pricey. I can't eat a turtle. Though if you had just struck it rich, then pricey didn't cut it. You wanted something that could really show your opulent wealth. And the Galapagos tortoise is deemed a choice luxury, even more than that of the green turtle. Now, while many were getting rich in gold...
Those things are awesome. They're like some of the coolest species ever, a Galapagos turtle. They literally swim across like the whole ocean to lay eggs and go back, and they're so cool. Oh my gosh. We suck. Humans suck. We suck.
Caspar Hawkins realized that it was the tortoise trade that would make him his fortune. And so in 1850, he left San Francisco for the Galapagos Islands in order to catch 100 tortoises, which back in San Francisco could be sold to the miners at $1,500 a piece, or about $60,000 today. Now, I am very happy to tell you that on his trip, he did not catch a single tortoise. He was a terrible tortoise hunter, but many other people were much better at it, and during the 1850s, they had really wiped out most of the Galapagos tortoises, and they're still not even recovered to this day. Now,
we're making the coolest things that exist, the coolest animals and wildlife we have. We're making them not exist so we could put them in a soup.
Eating these fancy exotic foods was not very common for most people, and really only happened when they discovered a big load of silver or gold. And when they did this, they tended to kind of spend it all. It was no unusual thing to see a company of these men who had never before thought of luxury beyond a good beefsteak and glass of whiskey, drinking their champagne at $10 a bottle, and eating their tongue in sardines, or warming in their smoky campfire their tin canisters of turtle soup and lobster salad. And while there were miners with their bags of silver and gold who could afford to eat high on the hog or high on the tortoise, most miners' diet was not this. Our diet consists of hard bread, flour, which we eat half-cooked, and salt pork, with occasionally a salmon, which we purchase of the Indians. Vegetables are not to be procured. Our drinking water comes down to us thoroughly
preserved well
impregnated with the mineral substances washed through the thousand cradles above us. And it wasn't just that they couldn't afford
That's one thing that's
better.
a big environmental problem is all the chemicals and stuff that go with mining eventually gets into the water table, and yeah, horrible for the environment and for people.
It was that they couldn't find anything better because most miners were not living in and around big cities like San Francisco. Most were still looking for their riches in places like this, in Cerro Gordo. Here, a nice supply of groceries was really hard to come by, and even when you could find basic groceries, you had to usually bid on them if you wanted to buy them. In 1855, Frank Marriott wrote about a small mining town where the miners prefer buying everything at auction, presuming always that your constitution will stand a mixture of salt butter, Chinese sugar, pickles, and bad brandy. Joe Bellow was an auctioneer, and long before his sale commenced, he would place a keg of butter or a bag of dried apples outside his store, and the miners would surround these luxuries like flies. And such is human nature that even in the mines, where few simpletons are to be found, there was no butter so rancid, but Joe Bellow could not dispose of. So miners in these small towns were fighting over even the meagerest of basic ingredients, which is why the lyrics to this 19th century miner's song probably rang true for most. In cabins rude our daily food is quickly counted o'er. Beans, bread, salt meat is all we eat, and the cold earth is our floor. The bread mentioned in
It sounded like something like hobbits would sing.
Bread, salt meat is all we eat, and the cold earth is our floor.
At the tavern, you know what I mean? The prancing pony.
The bread mentioned in that song was one of two types. The first, of course, was hardtack. And the second was something so popular amongst the miners that it actually became synonymous with them. Sometimes they were called sourdoughs.
And the thing about eating too, like with this is such an exhausting lifestyle, right? With mining and you're lifting and doing all that, like you exert so many calories. It'd be amazing to me if these guys weren't just like so skinny, and if you weren't making pay dirt on this. All the calories and stuff you get, and so much of the stuff they're doing is not going to do that. It's hard for me to imagine you could be a healthy miner.
There is a reason that San Francisco is famous for their sourdough bread, and it comes from the miners of this period.
Sourdough bread's
when you
not
were
bad.
up in the mountains for weeks, sometimes months at a time, getting a hold of fresh yeast or even powdered yeast was not easy. And so pretty much every miner above their stove hung a tin full of fermented dough used in place of yeast for making bread, biscuits, and flapjacks. Though sometimes it was said that if it was really cold, the miner would actually sleep with his sourdough in his bed under his blankets with him to keep it warm.
I would want someone to steal.
Now, while they were up
That's
in the mountains,
that'd be my
miners had to rely on their basic ingredients and their usually very basic cooking skills to survive, to make their food. But once a mining town like Cerro Gordo had grown up nearby, they would tend to come into town to eat. Many actually lived in the towns. And that's because they usually were in the mine for 12 hours a day. And just like today, after a hard day's of work,
so dangerous,
you say, let's just order in.
It was so dangerous. One thing that, of course, that came with the gold rush was the extension of the railroad, and railroading was even more dangerous than mining, especially because you would go through tunnels and you'd be using dynamite and that kind of thing. And so many of those jobs, a lot of the Americans wouldn't even touch. And depending on where you were in the country, it would usually be an Irishman, someone coming from Ireland. Again, they're like fleeing potato famines and all this and trying to get jobs, or fleeing the chaos of 19th century China, and you have Chinese people coming. They were the ones that would do a lot of these jobs because nobody would do that. And mining is going to, of course, eventually be a part of that
Back then, they were like, let's just go to the saloon.
Especially the
just because you were going to a saloon or a restaurant to get your food, that doesn't mean that it was necessarily much better. When visiting the small mining town of Angels Camp, California in the winter of 1865, Mark Twain wrote of the food at one establishment, saying beans and dishwater for breakfast, dishwater and beans for dinner, and both articles warmed over
couldn't
for
waste
supper.
water.
Again, this culinary monotony was usually just because it was hard to get a varied grocery list in many of these towns. Bringing in food took a long time, and so anything that could spoil couldn't be brought in. And that's why many of the foods were canned. Canned fruits, canned meats, canned vegetables,
That's how war
and
is,
of course
too.
the canned milk, like the kind that we're using in today's recipe. Even many saloons had to rely on these canned ingredients, like one that was near a mine in Globe, Arizona. The menu never varied.
And even the thing is too, their standards for what they would consider something being spoiled or potentially rotten is also very different than today. Like today, if it has a minor whiff of something, we're like, throw it out. But to them, it's got to be really bad. Okay, it goes for the military. The other video again we'd watched was eating in during World War II, and yeah, it would probably have to take a lot for them to be like, no, not eating that.
It consisted of a like one that was near a mine in Globe, Arizona. The menu never varied. It consisted of a platter of thin, evil-tasting steak cooked until it was like leather. This was passed around the table. Bread, coffee, condensed milk, and nearly always sugar. Sometimes this was missing. Occasionally boiled rice or stewed dried fruit. For this, we paid $9 each a week. Now, even if the steak was evil tasting, at least it was steak. At least it was fresh. And many mining towns did have access to fresh meat. Here in Cerro Gordo, they had cows and chickens and pigs and goats.
Sounds like it'd be the best thing.
They had a lake that was nearby and a river that was nearby where they could get fresh fish and everything. And then there was, of course, big game hunting, so they ate bighorn sheep. Essentially, for most miners, what you ate came down to what you had access to. Yeah. That and who was doing the cooking. See, not only were many miners Mexican and Chinese and foreign in general, but many of the saloon owners and restaurant owners and the cooks were Mexican, Chinese, German, Irish, Italian. And so those cuisines...
That's like the best part of immigration, migration is food. You get to share each other's best dishes and then combine those. Man, you got Mexican food coming in. You got food coming in from China. Then the American crap we're making.
Very popular already here in California and throughout the American West. And this very multicultural cuisine can actually be seen in a dinner that took place in the 1880s. It actually took place in New York, but it was made up of a bunch of people who had been here right when the gold rush was starting, and so they would get together every year and eat the foods that they used to eat. The champagne served was a brand from San Francisco, specially procured for the
crappy
occasion.
Food.
Under the caption, "To order if you want it," were grizzly bear steaks with frijoles, ribs of antelope with tortillas, carne seca with chili colorados, fried salt pork with slapjacks, stewed jackass rabbit with Moscow, mule rump steak with hardtack, and mysterious stew a la Chinese. Now, exactly what that mysterious stew a la Chinese was, I'm not sure, but Chinese food in general was very, very popular amongst the miners.
Oh, heck yeah.
The Americans would often eat
now again, Chinese food, like a lot of Mexican food and a lot of the food that we like to think is like actually foreign dishes in America is just American versions of it. Pizza, like that too. And if you go and actually go to like a traditional restaurant, you might be very surprised of the menu you actually see.
Dish called chop suey. It was on every menu. And then there were also imported foods from China that the Chinese miners would eat. Brent has found different things from China here in Cerro Gordo, and it's just crazy that it's come all this way back in the 1800s. And now
it would have been Qing Dynasty. Qing Dynasty falls in the 19 teens. And the 1800s, so you get your history lesson coming in here, was a very tumultuous time for Chinese people. There were famines, there were multiple rebellions, there were civil wars. Going through the century, you had like the Opium Wars, and Taiping Rebellion, which is the biggest peasant rebellion in history. Then you're going to get the anti-foreign wars like the Boxer Rebellion. All of these things were devastating for the Chinese people. And then as the Industrial Revolution was going on too, and China was not doing that, people thought that there would be a lot more growth and opportunity and fleeing the harsh circumstances in China by coming to the U.S. Here's the thing, though. People coming in, a lot of them didn't know exactly actually how crappy this would be as far as this lifestyle of being a miner here. Then there's going to be racist issues. They're going to have some of these problems in San Francisco, for example, where they actually passed legislation about, doing things like segregating the schools and those sort of things. So not a great life.
Desert. Now, perhaps one of the most iconic foreign cuisines that came to mining here in the U.S. was from the Cornish people. The people of Cornwall in the southwest of England were mining tin and copper as far back as the early Bronze Age. So when the silver mines of Colorado and California opened up, many a Cornishman came over to put his skills to good use. They were called Cousin Jacks, and some of the foods that they brought over had wonderfully whimsical names.
Okay, Britain. I can't believe there was a time where people thought of your food as a delicacy. You have the worst food on the planet. I'm sorry, British people. It's bad. And what makes it worse is the meme that is so true. You guys colonized a fourth of the population of the planet. You had a monopoly on the global spice trade, and your food is boring. How did that happen? It only take the horrible conditions of a miner to think whatever is about to come out of Cornwall is going to be something that's going to be better than Chinese food and Mexican food. Give me a break.
Like kidley broth, figgy hobbin, and junket and cream. I had to look all those up. Kidley broth is a sort of onion broth with bread chunks, figgy hobbin is a pastry stuffed with raisins, and junket and cream is a sort of pudding made of curdled milk and nutmeg. But there was one dish that they brought over that I did not have to look up, and that's because it is still rather popular in many communities here in the US today and back in jolly old England, and that is the famous Cornish pasty, which was basically a hand pie filled with beef, onion, rutabaga or swede, and potato. Fortunate indeed is the miner so steeped in connubial bliss as to possess a better half who in her loving care, as a token of her affection, places a pasty or two in the lunchbox of her miner spouse. A letter from home is what the miners term such a setup.
He's basically saying if you could find a woman that will put these English Hot Pockets in your lunchbox, you better wife her immediately. Unfortunately, that's the translation into like modern speech from that.
My better half is not here to make me a pasty, so I'm going to just have to stick with my biscuits and gravy. So I better make that gravy. Yeah. So for this, you can start with any greasy meat you might have. You can use sausage or bacon, but I'm going to use the meat that most miners had access to, and that is salt pork. Now it needs to be rinsed to get some of the salt out as much as you can.
Sausage made out of pork.
And then chopped up really, really fine, and then put it in a skillet and cook it until most of the fat has melted. Once it's cooked, remove it from the pan, but leave the grease.
Yeah, you want the grease.
Then we're going to sprinkle in some flour. Now, how much you use really is kind of based on how thick you want your gravy, but typically it's about the same as the amount of grease. Stir it all in, making sure there aren't any lumps, and cook it for just a couple of minutes until it starts to thicken, and then add some of that evaporated milk. Now, one thing I did find is that if you use evaporated milk, it has a lower water consistency than regular milk. And so it makes the flour mixture kind of seize up. But if you just keep whisking, it finally turns back into a nice smooth gravy. Then you can go ahead and add some of that pork back in and dish it up on your biscuits. Yeah. And here we are, biscuits and gravy for an Old West miner. I
mean, as long as you're not using all those weird alternate ingredients for like the biscuits and the gravy, I think biscuits gravy is so good. It's the most underrated breakfast, but on top of that, it's just good. Need some pepper on it, though.
I love biscuits and gravy.
I do, too. Pepper. Put pepper on it.
You do not need to add more salt to that. You got a little pepper.
Biscuits, gravy, need pepper.
Plenty salty because of that pork. Now, the biscuits did not rise as much as I would have expected, especially because I'm at like 8,000 feet elevation. It's Max from editing, and I have been racking my brain trying to figure out why my biscuits didn't rise, and as I'm editing, I realized that the milk that I put into the actual recipe did not have any baking soda. For some reason, and I can't recall why, I made 2 bowls of milk, and the one that went in was the one without any baking soda. So, just letting you know, it wasn't the recipe that screwed up, it was the miners would be flipping tables. I made a mistake, and there it is. So if you make this recipe, just add the baking soda, and it should work out just fine, I would think. Anyway, luckily, they did still taste really good, so I'll let that Max tell you about that. But the flavor is excellent. So are they the best biscuits and gravy I've ever tasted? No. My grandpa's biscuits and gravy are the best I've ever tasted, but
Grandpa Miller?
If I was a miner out for days at a time on a mountain, that would have been a darn good breakfast. And so yeah, go ahead and make them, or go buy some biscuits and gravy somewhere. One of my favorite dishes. And check out Brent Underwood's channel, Ghost Town Living, for more about the amazing town of Cerro Gordo. And I will see you next time on Tasting History.
Final thoughts. All right, so what do you guys think? Do you think you could have made it as a miner? Could you have handled the work, the violence, the food in this case? just to potentially make that fortune, right? It's supposed to be the American dream going on there. What you think of the food there, though? Are you a big biscuits and gravy fan? You heard me. I love them. Anyways, want to hear what you guys have to say. All right, again, if you've been watching to the end here, thank you for doing that. If you have video suggestions, best place to do is come over to our Discord server. Link is down below. You also get to chat and hang out with it, and I'm there a lot and hanging out with people too, but best place to get video suggestions, because again, this video was suggested by the community and then voted on by the community. And with that, we'll see y'all next time.